So, here's a hypothetical. Imagine there was a Silicon Valley startup who was offering a service to prospective parents. You can pay them $60,000 to look at the genes of your unborn child and modify them to ensure that your child is born with above average IQ. How would you feel about living in a world where rich people can ensure that their children are smarter than most other people's children? Take a second to think about it. And now imagine instead a world in which rich people can pay $60,000 to an elite private school to ensure that their child has above average intelligence. How would you feel about living in that world? Well, good news or bad news, depending on how you answered the question, you already do live in that world, at least according to Who Gets to Be Smart by Bri Lee, which is a newish Australian non-fiction book that I really enjoyed. I've recorded a few different versions of this video because it's very difficult to try to do justice to all the themes that are explored in this book, but I'm going to try to give you the bare bones of it. Basically, the book argues that what we describe as intelligence is A, fairly limited, and B, it tends to just be code for went to a fancy university and or a fancy private high school and or a fancy private primary school. And that means that a whole heap of people are excluded from the opportunity to be quote unquote smart, either because they have a disability or because they come from a low income background or they speak English as a second language or they are Indigenous. This is an Australian book with an Australian focus, or for a variety of other reasons, many of which overlap. And that means the pool from which we pluck our leaders, both in politics and in academia and in the business community, that pool is missing a lot of people. There's a lot of people who never get the chance to be in it. So we venerate a small group of people as quote unquote smart, when in reality they're just kind of the winners of a rigged lottery. That's the absolute bare bones of this book. And it's really good. I think everyone should read it. I especially enjoyed the bits where Bri Lee kind of dives into her own personal experience over the course of writing and researching the book. And she's really, I don't want to say brave, because that it's just such a cliche to talk about this kind of book and this kind of author as being brave, but it's remarkable the amount to which she is willing to let the reader see what is rattling around inside her skull at any given time, with apparently no thought to how we might judge her. Like, it's refreshingly honest for a non-fiction book, if that makes any sense at all. And there are a lot of... Now, I kind of didn't read this book for a while because I thought I didn't need to. I figured if anyone had already learned this lesson, it was going to be me. I went to public schools my whole life. I don't have a university education. I tried to get one, but dropped out in my first semester. And then I couldn't get a decent job because I didn't have a degree. And then when I eventually did get a job, I was surrounded by people who did have degrees but didn't actually seem to have learned anything at university. And I found myself kind of picking up all the slack for all the things that they didn't know how to do. And but on the other hand, I'm also biased in a couple of different ways. So one is that once I became a best-selling author, suddenly I was in demand as a speaker. People would hire me to sort of teach creative writing workshops, and usually the only institutions that could afford to do that were these elite private schools. So I got to go into these fancy rich schools that I had never had the opportunity to go to as a student, and kind of see how they work from the inside and be the same mixture of amazed and horrified that Bri Lee describes when she goes to Oxford at the beginning of the book. And the other bit of my bias is that you may have noticed that I sound smart, or at least so I have been told. And that's because I love to much as I'd love to sit here and brag about how, look, I came from nothing. I went to public schools and I don't have a degree and I'm still this successful, amazing author. But my parents are both doctors who did go to fancy universities. So they, I kind of won the same rigged lottery that Bri Lee is talking about, but just at a different in a different generation. So there's lots of interesting stuff in this book. I didn't think I would learn as much from it as I did, so that's egg on my face. There are a lot of tangents in the book, and some of them go to really interesting places. Others of them I never quite managed to work out how they were connected, and there are some that so some of these tangents I think are a bit too long, but others are a bit too short, perhaps. She spends a lot of time talking about statues of people from hundreds of years ago, and it's rehashes some of the old arguments about how we should tear the statues down because these people did terrible things, and then rehashes the argument against that, saying no, but we've got to judge these people by the standards of their time, and then rehashes the arguments against that by saying no, even at the time people knew this was wrong. There were abolitionists, anyone who the statues of the founding fathers in the United States who owned slaves, there were abolitionists at the time. You can't say that they didn't know it was wrong. And as for Captain Cook, there were people in Great Britain who were protesting against the invasion of Australia because they could tell it was ethically wrong. But that was one of those tangents where it's already a little bit long and maybe not necessarily as connected to the theme of the book as I might have liked, but I almost wanted it to be longer. I kind of wanted the book to then apply that reasoning to present day, because there are things which are socially acceptable to do now which in the future will be illegal, and we already kind of know what they are because there are already people protesting against them. These include things like eating meat or driving a petrol-powered car. Like, both those things will be illegal in future. People are protesting against them at the moment. If we erected a statue right now of someone like Grace Tame or Dylan Alcott, I think those are worthy figures to look up to and to venerate. But in the future, someone might be saying you should tear these statues down. Those people ate meat, they drove petrol-powered cars. I don't actually know if that's true about these two particular people, by the way. This is just an example. And then someone else can say, but you've got to judge them by the standards of their time. And then someone else could say, there were already vegetarians in 2022. And you could argue that, like, owning slaves is worse than eating meat or driving a petrol-powered car, and obviously you'd be right. But the point is that everything exists along this moral continuum, and it takes enormous kind of moral fortitude, I guess, to resist the standards of your time. And again, not everyone has the privilege to do that. Like, oh man, I'm already going on one of these tangents that sort of the book is so prone to. But I want to make sure I'm kind of articulating myself well here. The one extra little addendum I would put onto that is that this book spends quite a lot of time talking about Cecil Rhodes, he of the Rhodes Scholarship, and also Captain Cook again. And in both of those cases, those are people where the statues of them were built because of the terrible things that they did, as opposed to despite them. So that's another thing you could chuck into the argument. Anyway, the book doesn't really go into that. It goes along this tangent up to the point where other people have explored, and then doesn't take that extra step to kind of go beyond the standard arguments. So that was a bit of a shame. But again, the book's not about that. This is a book about education. It's a book about science. It's a book about wealth. It's a book about privilege. It's a book about race. It's about all these sorts of things, and has an interesting take on every single one of them. So I really enjoyed that. It is a shame that at the very end, Bri Lee, this is kind of a spoiler. I don't know if you can do a spoiler for non-fiction, but eventually she's deciding whether to do a PhD or not. And she decides that she will. And I think it's a mark of how passionately argued this book is and how beautifully written it is that I felt personally betrayed by that, because she spent the last 300 pages railing against academia as this sort of this ghastly institution that kind of props up the people who already have power and stamps on and tramples and condescends to the people who have no power, and then she just kind of dives even further into it. But everything Bri Lee does, again, she does with that same sort of honesty and self-reflection. So she's aware of the hypocrisy of it at the end, which I thought was really interesting too. So yeah, this is a terrific book, Who Gets to Be Smart by Bri Lee. Next week I'll have another video for you. I haven't quite decided what to make it about though. I'm reading Little Fires Everywhere by Celestine, but a little while ago I also read Dear Girls by Ali Wong. And I have thoughts about both these books, but at the moment Ali Wong is very much in headlines, so maybe it's a sensible time to make that video instead of the Celestine one. So if you have an opinion, feel free to let me know in the comments. You can also hit me up on Twitter at JackHeathWriter. You can subscribe to my newsletter at jackheathwriter.com. I've written a couple of books, but most recently Kill Your Brother, which makes a great Mother's Day gift. That's probably enough from me. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and chime in the comments to tell us who you think is smart and why.